Hey, welcome back to Get Knowledged. Okay, before we get into today's video, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. What if you just stopped? Like completely, forever. No more alone time, no more me moments. Just done. Now, before you close this tab, hear me out. Because the science behind what actually happens to your body and your brain when you stop pleasuring yourself is genuinely one of the most fascinating, most misunderstood, and most talked about topics in biology right now. There are communities built around it. There are men swearing it changed their lives. There are studies that went completely viral. There are claims about testosterone, about motivation, about becoming a better version of yourself. But here's the thing. A lot of what you have heard is either half true, taken out of context, or just plain wrong. And today, we are going to go through all of it, slowly, carefully, together. The real science, the actual studies, the full picture, not just the parts that make a good headline. So grab something to drink, get comfortable, because today on Get Knowledged, we are going deep. Let's go. Okay, so first, let's just be real with each other for a second. This is something that a lot of people do. We are talking about more than half of all women, over 50%, and about 70% of all men doing this at least once a month. So if you have ever felt like you were the only one, you are very much not alone. Like, statistically speaking, this is one of the most common human behaviors on the planet. And yet, nobody really talks about it openly. It's one of those things where everyone knows it happens, but the moment someone brings it up in a serious conversation, people get awkward, which is actually a problem. Because when we don't talk about something openly, myths start to grow. And those myths, they spread fast. You may have heard things like, it drains your energy, it kills your motivation, it lowers your testosterone, real men don't do it. Or on the other side, it's completely harmless. Do it as much as you want, there are zero downsides. Both of those extremes, not quite accurate. The truth, as science usually gives us, sits somewhere in the middle. And it is way more interesting than either side admits. So let's start from the beginning. Now, to understand why this conversation even became so huge, we need to go back to 2003. A group of researchers published a study, and this study, on the surface, seemed pretty straightforward. They were looking at testosterone levels in men who abstained from pleasuring themselves for a period of time. And what they found sent the internet into a frenzy. After 1 week of not doing it, testosterone levels went up. By how much? 40%. 40%. Now, if you know anything about testosterone, you know that is a big number. Testosterone affects your energy, your confidence, your muscle growth, your mood, your drive. So when that number dropped into the world, people lost their minds. Headlines everywhere, forums going crazy, men making pledges to stop forever. And out of all of that noise, a movement was born. It became known as the NoFap movement. Fapping being a slang word for male self-pleasure. And suddenly, thousands, then millions of men were joining online communities, making 30-day challenges, sharing stories about how stopping changed their entire lives. The movement grew into something massive. And look, some of those personal stories are genuinely moving. Real people saying they felt more focused, more confident, more present in their relationships. We are not dismissing any of that. But here is where it gets interesting. Here is what almost nobody reported. The journalists who grabbed that 40% headline and ran with it skipped a very important part of the study. Ready? The testosterone spike lasted until day 7. On day 8, it came back down, all the way back to normal, just like that. No explanation given in the study, no follow-up, just back to baseline. So the 40% spike that launched a worldwide movement lasted exactly 1 week, and then it was gone. Now, does that mean the study was useless? Not at all. It was interesting. It raised real questions worth exploring. But it does mean that the version of the story most people heard was incomplete. And science hates incomplete stories. So here is a fair question. If one study found a 40% testosterone spike after a week, what did other studies find? Because science doesn't rely on one study. That's not how it works. You need multiple studies, different researchers, different conditions, different groups of people, and then you look at where the results agree. So, what did those other studies say? Some of them found no difference at all, zero, nothing significant. Researchers compared men who regularly pleasured themselves with men who completely abstained, and their testosterone levels nearly identical. Which raises a really important question. If abstaining reliably raised testosterone, why didn't every study find that? And the answer brings us to something scientists call confounding variables. Let me explain that in plain English. When someone decides to stop pleasuring themselves, they usually don't just stop that one thing. They tend to change their whole lifestyle. They start exercising more, they sleep better, they cut out junk food, they drink more water, they become more intentional about their health overall. And guess what all of those things do? They raise testosterone. Exercise raises testosterone. Good sleep raises testosterone. Improved diet raises testosterone. So when a person stops and then notices they feel stronger, more energetic, more confident, is that because of the abstaining itself? Or is it because they also started going to the gym 5 times a week, sleeping 8 hours, and eating better food? The science cannot easily separate those things. And that makes it really, really hard to say for certain that abstaining itself is the direct cause of any testosterone changes. This is not a small detail. This is the whole story. Because when you strip away all the lifestyle changes and you look purely at abstaining versus not abstaining, the testosterone difference gets much, much smaller. Sometimes it disappears entirely. Does that mean testosterone is not affected at all? We cannot say that for sure either. What we can say is the 40% headline was real, but also incomplete. And the full picture is a lot more complicated and a lot more honest. Okay, so testosterone was one of the big claims. The other major one from the NoFap community was about sexual performance. Specifically, supporters of abstaining claim that stopping would improve things like timing and control during intimacy. So what does science say about that? Well, a study looked at this directly. They took a group of men and had some of them abstain from any self-pleasure for 3 weeks. The others continued as normal. Then they measured performance. And the result? No significant difference. The men who had been abstaining for 3 weeks did not perform better than the men who had not. Their timing was roughly the same. Their control was roughly the same. Now, this does not mean that abstaining has zero effect on intimacy. Relationships and sexual experience are very personal and very complex. There are emotional and psychological layers here that a single study cannot fully capture. But purely from a physical performance standpoint, the evidence is not there to support the claim that stopping will automatically make you better in bed. All right, now here's a section I personally find really fascinating. Let's talk about sperm. Specifically, what happens to sperm quality when someone abstains for a long time? The NoFap community often claimed that not ejaculating for extended periods would lead to stronger, higher quality sperm. The idea being, if you save it up, it must be better, right? Turns out, science disagrees. Here is what researchers actually found. Men who ejaculated more frequently, not less, had sperm that were stronger swimmers. Think about it like this. Imagine a swimming pool. Now imagine the water in that pool has been sitting there completely still for weeks. What does stale water look like? It does not flow as well. It gets a bit tired. Now imagine fresh, moving water. It flows better. It is more active, more dynamic. Sperm that are regularly cycled out, replaced with new, fresh sperm, tend to be healthier and better at doing their job, which is reaching and fertilizing an egg. So the idea that holding everything in makes for super sperm, not really supported by the evidence. Now, here is where it gets even more interesting. What happens to sperm that is not ejaculated? Does it just sit there forever? No. The body has a system for that. When sperm is not released, the body actually breaks it down. The nutrients inside, proteins, zinc, various compounds, get recycled back into the body. It is genuinely one of the most efficient recycling systems in nature. Your body basically says, okay, we're not using this right now. Let's reclaim those resources. Which means the idea that not ejaculating means you are storing up power is a bit of a myth. Your body is already quietly recycling and resetting behind the scenes. And speaking of the body's reset system, let's talk about something that does not get discussed nearly enough: wet dreams. Yes, we are going there. So, 83% of men have had a wet dream at least once in their life, and 37% of women have too. Yes, women experience them as well, even though that is talked about far less. Now, one theory about why wet dreams happen, especially during extended abstaining, is that the body is essentially doing its own maintenance. If sperm is not being released regularly, the body may trigger a release during sleep as a way to cycle out older sperm and make room for newer, fresher ones. It is like your body running its own cleaning cycle while you sleep. Is this theory 100% proven? Not completely. The science on wet dreams is still pretty limited, and honestly, researchers have found it a little tricky to study for fairly obvious reasons. But the theory makes biological sense, and the data on how common wet dreams are, especially during periods of abstaining, does support the idea that the body has its own natural way of managing things. Which is honestly kind of amazing when you think about it. Your body is always working to keep things in balance, even when you are unconscious. This is the most important section: slow, clear, thoughtful. Okay, now we are getting to what I think is the most important part of this whole conversation, and this is where things get really real. Let's talk about the brain. Specifically, let's talk about what happens in your brain when you pleasure yourself, and what happens when you stop. When you experience pleasure, any kind of pleasure, your brain releases chemicals called neurotransmitters. The two big ones here are dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine is often called the feel-good chemical. It is what gives you that rush of excitement, that sense of reward, that feeling of motivation and drive. Serotonin is more about deep contentment, that calm, satisfied, everything is okay feeling. Now, self-pleasure triggers the release of both of these. That is why it feels good. That is literally the brain's reward system doing its job. But here is where it can become a problem. If you are doing this very frequently, and I mean very frequently, compulsively, as a habit that feels out of control, here is what starts to happen inside your brain. Your brain gets flooded with dopamine and serotonin over and over. And your brain is smart. It notices this. It says, we are getting way too much of these chemicals. Let's protect ourselves. So what does it do? It reduces its own sensitivity to those chemicals. It literally pulls back some of the receptors, the tiny receivers that detect dopamine and serotonin, so that the same amount of stimulation produces less of a response. This is called desensitization. And what does desensitization feel like in real life? It feels like nothing is exciting anymore. It feels like you need more stimulation to feel the same level of happiness. It feels like motivation drops, like regular life feels kind of gray and flat. Sound familiar? This is the core of what people describe as compulsive behavior around self-pleasure. It is not just a moral issue or a willpower issue. There is real neuroscience behind it. And here is the flip side. If someone who has been in that compulsive cycle chooses to stop, or to significantly reduce the habit, their brain begins to reset. The receptors that were pulled back start to become sensitive again. Dopamine and serotonin start landing with more impact. Smaller things start to feel rewarding again. Motivation comes back. Energy comes back. Life feels a little more colorful. This is likely the core reason why many people in the NoFap community report dramatic improvements in their lives. Not necessarily because abstaining has some magical physical power, but because their brains were desensitized, and abstaining allowed them to reset. That is a real, science-backed explanation for why some people genuinely feel better when they stop. But, and this is important, this applies specifically to people whose habits had become compulsive or excessive. For someone who has a healthy, balanced, moderate relationship with self-pleasure, the brain desensitization is unlikely to be happening in the same way. which is why the science says two different things to two different groups of people, and only you know which group you are in. Now, we have spent a lot of this video talking about what happens when you stop, but fairness demands that we also talk about what the science says about doing it in the first place, because the research on that side actually quite positive. Here is what studies have found. Self-pleasure has been linked to better sleep quality. The release of hormones like oxytocin and prolactin after pleasure helps the body relax and transition into deep sleep. If you have ever wondered why people tend to feel sleepy afterward, that is why. It has also been associated with reduced stress levels. That release of dopamine and serotonin we talked about? In moderate amounts, those chemicals are your brain's natural stress relief system. Some studies have even found connections to reduced pain sensitivity. The body's own natural painkillers, called endorphins, are released during pleasure, which can temporarily reduce things like headaches and muscle tension. There is also research suggesting it can support immune function. One study found that pleasuring yourself led to a short-term increase in white blood cell activity, the cells that help your body fight off infection. And for men specifically, there is research suggesting that regular ejaculation may be associated with a lower risk of prostate cancer. One large study found that men who ejaculated more frequently had a noticeably lower chance of developing prostate cancer later in life. Now, these studies are mostly focused on men, because historically most medical research has been focused on men. But the limited research on women suggests that for women, self-pleasure is largely beneficial with very little evidence of harm. So the balanced picture looks something like this. For most people, in moderation, with a healthy relationship, the science suggests it is a normal, beneficial activity with real health advantages. For people who have developed a compulsive habit that feels out of control, stepping back can allow the brain to reset, and that reset can genuinely improve quality of life. Neither extreme, always bad or always unlimited, is what the science actually shows. So, what would actually happen if you completely stopped? Here is the honest answer. If you have a healthy, balanced habit, probably not as much as you have been told. Your testosterone is not going to skyrocket permanently. Your performance is not going to dramatically improve. Your sperm is not being magically preserved. But if your habit has become compulsive, if it has been controlling you more than you have been controlling it, then stopping or pulling back significantly could genuinely help. Your brain can reset. Your dopamine sensitivity can return. Your motivation and energy can come back in a real, measurable way. And maybe the most important thing science tells us here is this: know yourself. Be honest with yourself. And do not let a headline, whether it says stop forever or do it as much as you want, make that decision for you. You are smarter than a headline. And now you are more knowledged too. All right, that is today's episode of Get Knowledged. Now I want to hear from you. Did anything in this video surprise you? Did it change how you think about this topic? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Honestly, this is one of those topics where the conversation in the comments is always more interesting than people expect. If this video opened your eyes a little, share it. Send it to a friend. You never know who needs the full picture instead of just the headline. And if you want more science that actually makes sense, come back tomorrow. We drop new videos every single day. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay knowledged.